I'm going to be talking about today is not in the book necessarily, but reflects some research that was recently published this year. And it kind of gives an introduction to sort of some of the methodologies that I work with, and really sort of introduces how we might use historic visual media to think through, in this case, ice and glacial histories. So in 1909, at the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition in Seattle on the west coast of the US, a whole village was constructed and was billed as offering what was quoted as an authentic depiction of life in the frozen north. In front of a giant log cabin covered with the plaster peaks of ice, Inuits, Yupik, Inupiaq, and Tlingit men, women, and children from Russia, Alaska, and Canada were conflated together under one generalized slur, spelled out in Hollywood-style light bulbs. Born on the grounds of the 1893 World Exposition in Chicago, Columbia Inupiaq and her family were among the advertised 50 participants and residents in this year-long show. Inside, the facade of snow and ice continued, with the faux frozen terrain constructed from plaster, canvas, and white paint. In one photograph, Inupiaq was shown alongside her mother, father, and siblings, clambering over a plaster-covered igloo surrounded by strings of fairy lights. Sorry, there we go. In a neighbouring section to the Inuit village in which Inupiaq was born, a tableau farthest north was shown at the World Exposition in Chicago and similarly incorporated plaster casts into the encompassing design of the panorama. It portrayed a scene from the fateful Lady Franklin Bay expedition that took place between 1881 and 1884, which, led by the American Adolphus Greely, intended to establish a meteorological observation station as part of the first International Polar Year and set the then record of farthest north. Here, the panoramic painting of the base camp at Fort Conger, a US-operated exploration camp in the Qikiqtarjuq region of Nunavut, served as a backdrop to the life-size wax figures of an Inuit guide, taxidermy dogs, and army officers in winter garments. Meanwhile, plaster snowdrifts, icicles, and icebergs created what was described as, quote, a realistic Arctic scene with its bleak desolation of tumultuous ice packs and boundless fields of snow glaring under a sun that dazzles but does not heat. These turn-of-the-century forays into panoramic set design built upon the century-long fascination with panoramas. Perhaps the most famous of these was Robert Burford's view of the polar regions, made in 1850, where pinnacles and peaks of icebergs and glacial crevasses dominate the expanse of the Arctic summer panorama seen above. Glaciers and icebergs have merged in a white and icy haze, which wrote, quote, whole forming a sublime and splendid exhibition of icy grandeur, end quote. Where the Arctic sublime implies a romantic and imperial aesthetic of imposing and dangerous landscapes, thinking after the Arctic sublime, as Benjamin Morgan frames it, accounts for the environmental and scientific histories of the panorama, aesthetic experience, and polar exploration. Originally conceived to showcase Anglophone exploration, the Arctic panorama is often framed by conversations of a Victorian imperial imaginary. And in this talk, I identify the broader, complementary, and multifaceted visual representations of Arctic ice, from the Victorian spectacle of the panorama to contemporary panoramic repeat photography and VR technology. Although no literary study nor visual analysis can hope to recognise the full extent of our planet's icy surface, by centering the globalizing agency of ice, I shift focus from art history's fixation on romanticized accounts of the Arctic, Antarctic, and Alpine sublime. By instead positioning ice as a material agent within its own exploratory and scientific history and narrative, I'm less concerned with a human nostalgia for what has been or is being lost. Identifying the role of ice as an elemental matter in the panoramic image, I argue instead for an understanding of the liveliness of ice, grappling with its materiality, locality, and dynamic ability to inspire across spatial, temporal, and sensorial panoramic platforms. So returning to Burford's panorama, along the horizon, the uneven surface of the coast of Greenland acts as a backdrop to what Burford described in the panorama booklet as, quote, the manufactory of icebergs, end quote. Where the geographical location needed to be accurate in the panorama, scenes were otherwise embellished. The carving of icebergs from the so-called barrier of ice is shown as towering over the entrapped HMS Investigator to the left, hemmed in between the face of the glacier and the so-called enormous iceberg, recently carved from its icy mass. The gathering of men spearing a polar bear out in the fjord, much like the calm sea, appear oblivious to the effects of the iceberg upon the water's surface. From the shock and awe of far-flung lands to the spectacle of large-scale carving events, the materiality of ice facilitates the modes of observation involved in creating and viewing these panoramic images at the centre of this talk. No longer is ice limited to a spectacularly sublime environment displayed for our delectation. While it performs this role in the 19th century panorama, ice also renders both itself and the landscape portable, both physically and thematically. Here, the crenellations of panoramic ice disrupt any boundaries between scientific observation, Arctic exploration, and artistic imaginaries. Until the mid-19th century, visual representations of the Arctic were frequently reliant on naval expeditions and officers. Coastal delineation was a skill taught at Royal Naval and Military College, yet these profiles contrast with the notably frequent omission of ice in Arctic maps and charts, while otherwise noted water currents, the northernmost tree line, and other pertinent yet equally variable environmental information was noted. Images of charted spaces often failed to note the substance that, ironically, hindered and prevented colonial expansion and exploration, but which remains crucial for Inuit hunters and Arctic wildlife. Often, charts, maps, and sketches by said officers and artists were later converted to life-size panoramas. This can be said of the inspirational drawings made by Lieutenant William Henry Brown, seen here, that went on to inspire Burford's view of the polar regions. Where ice is often notable in its omissions from cartographic visualizations of the search for the Northwest Passage, in Burford's accompanying description for view of the polar regions, as in the panorama itself, ice is very much central to Sir James Clark Ross's, that is the nephew of Sir John Ross, 1848 to 1849 expeditionary account and the ensuing visual narrative. Through the shading of the fragmented faces of fractured ice, the sea and icebergs begin to merge, casting shadows over a topographically indeterminable landscape. While visually static, the implied mobility of the ice renders the landscape indeterminable, despite Burford localising the scenes in Glacier Harbour on Greenland's west coast. As Avon O'Doherty writes, quote, the reader is placed firstly within seasons, times rather than places, and secondly within polar regions, a term so vague it could be anywhere within the Arctic and Antarctic circles, end quote. In addition to the icy imagery of the panorama, ice and the modes by which the panorama could be viewed offered a sensory and expansive experience of the Arctic, one that manifested expeditionary accounts of and scientific interest in the northern cryosphere. So where the moving panorama regularly travelled from town to town with a static audience seated in an auditorium as a long roll painting was moved before them, panoramas such as Burford's view of the polar regions in the Leicester Square Rotunda in the centre of London were made of a large circular canvas displayed in a specially designed structure and viewed from a central double viewing platform. The combination of the panorama and the viewing platform achieved the effect of transporting the viewer to another world, to landmarks alive in their geographical imagination only, places they would likely never be in the position to visit, but which the panorama allowed them to become familiar with nonetheless. While circular panoramas were known to travel on occasion, these objects often deteriorated in the course of being transported, hence their disappearance from the material record of the period. Panoramas were, quote, often changing their meaning and form during their journeys, end quote, perhaps much like the icy landscapes that Arctic panoramas sought to present. The panorama captured an imagined and momentary instance of a fleeting substance, that is ice, and took it on an international journey. Experiencing the hyperrealism of the icy Arctic panorama could produce an emotional and sensory overload. The circular panorama at the Leicester Square Rotunda, in particular, was known to have disorientated its viewers through the overwhelming false reality of the display. Heightening reality, the circular canvas of the view of the polar regions, for example, paradoxically created a total environment, but within a confined and limited space. As a John Bull critic wrote, quote, "The sense of space is not wanting," end quote. Art historians Katie Trumpener and Tim Barringer have more recently proposed that the panorama was an early version of installation art, and that, quote, 360-degree panoramic paintings constitute a pioneering, paradigmatic visual manifestation of modernity, end quote. Here, for example, comparison might be made between the panorama and the performativity embodied in touring installation works, such as Olafur Eliasson's 360-degree Room for All Colours, made in 2002. Ice as the performing agent is not alluded to here. We might therefore extend this line of thinking to Eliasson's cyclical Ice Watch, the example shown here from 2014. As Eliasson positions blocks of ice retrieved from the Greenland ice sheet in the orientation of a clock face, the same effect is achieved as in another panorama, the Boothia panorama, which I discussed later, and which encircled the viewer with unfamiliar icy formations on both the printed page and in the rotunda. The panoramic sensorium went beyond personal and collective emotions, lighting, and space, and was often enlivened by sounds as part of a cumulative experience. In a playbill from Mr. Rignall's late Victorian magnificent panorama of the Arctic regions, the sensory experience of the panorama, by now commonly referred to as the cyclorama, is advertised and promoted above the visual details of the display. Accompanied by music and a descriptive lecture, Rignall emphasised the all-inclusive experience of the panorama beyond the strictly visual. Described as a repertoire of new songs to be sung by the tenor Urs Diffrin and contralto Miss Meredith Elliott, which included Michael William Balfe's duet "The Sailor Sighs as Sinks His Native Shore." The advertisement also highlighted how Rignall, who would be delivering the accompanying lecture, had given a total of over 480 similar lectures at the St James Hall and Egyptian Hall in London, recognising himself as the so-called premier lecturer of the time. Having been proclaimed Queen of the Carnival, Columbia Anutsiak, as we noted earlier, also delivered lectures and tours of the village in Seattle. One article in the Seattle Daily Times described how, quote, "Columbia will hold a series of public receptions in the Inuit village every afternoon and evening this week, at which she will converse with her visitors, tell them of her early life, of her experiences in the North, and present each with an autographed postcard of herself," end quote. As part of Rignall's show, a sledging suit worn by a petty officer on the HMS Discovery was also to be introduced alongside a show and tell of the duffel sleeping bag, a necessary piece of equipment on a polar expedition. Earlier panoramas went further and employed faux terrain, and in the case of view of the polar regions, various furs, to add to the three-dimensional depth to the painted image, as later seen in Chicago and Seattle. While in an earlier, more immediate display following Greely's failed endeavour, the New Orleans Cotton Exposition in 1884 displayed life-size mannequins dressed in fur and animal hides, surrounding a vessel with its sails hoisted and a sledge laden with supplies tied down by a rope. The preoccupation with set design, making the panoramic experience into something bigger and better, also coincided with the 19th century fascination with living exhibitions, that is, the display of living humans, often within World's Fairs, as in the case of Seattle and Chicago, or other geographically or anthropologically specific exhibitions. Often, the image of a frozen Arctic environment provided the setting for these living human displays of indigenous Arctic peoples. A few years after the first Arctic panorama was exhibited by Henry Barker in 1822, William Bullock famously exhibited, also in London, the Sami reindeer herder Jens Thomason Holm and his wife Karen, alongside their child, belongings, and several reindeer, against a dramatic panorama of a frozen Arctic landscape. This is one of many such examples, with Catherine Baglow noting that, quote, during the 19th and early 20th centuries, close to 400 reindeer herding Sami, with their tents, dogs, sleds, and reindeer, were travelling European and North American cities. Beyond living humans and wax figures, plaster icebergs and animal furs, the brief descriptions of the scenes embodied within Rignold's panorama noted an accompanying, quote, wonderful and instantaneous dioramic effect, end quote. This recognises the influence of Louis Daguerre's dioramas, among other sources of inspiration on the 19th century panorama and other forms of performative visual media. Through lighting, sound effects, and the occasional wind, steam, mist, Daguerre's dioramas closely figured sound and movement in the dioramic experience. Writing about the dioramas staged by the German theatrical painter Carl Wilhelm Gropius in the late 1820s, Helmut and Alison Gernsheim noted how, quote, a view of Grindelwald Glacier was accompanied by the sound of cracking ice, splashing water, and the rumbling of distant avalanches, end quote. Comparison, therefore, might also be drawn with lantern slides and the panorama's predecessor, the Eiderphysikon, both predicated on the use of sound and light effects in their staging. Philippe Jacques Lutherberg's Eiderphysikon, first exhibited in London in 1781, was essentially a very large, theatre-sized peep show that employed three-dimensional models, sound, light, and cloud effects to create an illusion of perspective and depth. Given the prevalence of icy sounds in earlier panorama and diorama booklets, it is possible that Rignold recreated the shifting, cracking, fragmenting, and overturning of ice that so often noisily permeated the Arctic landscape, largely thought of as sublimely silent. Or that mist and steam were employed to create the effect of the prevalent Arctic fogs that often hung over the sea, land, and ice and stymied polar exploration. Meanwhile, we know that mirrors and artificial lighting helped communicate Greely's farthest north tableau. Through the sounds and effects used to accompany the panorama, the audience is exposed to a transcendent and totalizing spectatorial, sensorial, and scientific experience. The art historian Mark Cheetham writes how, quote, Arctic voyages functioned fully only when the circle was complete, when voyagers return and recount their exploits, when images of the Arctic are disseminated, and when scientific data are presented and discussed, end quote. The cyclical 360-degree nature of the panorama, therefore, might be seen as the culminative point for certain Arctic expeditions and scientific achievements. Viewers complete the journey. In the publication accompanying Burford's earlier panorama, A View of the Continent of Boothia, which I drew in comparison with Eliasson's Ice Watch earlier on, the panoramic image is reproduced as a complete circle. The Boothia Peninsula, named after the expedition's patron Sir Felix Booth by Captain John Ross following his Arctic voyage of 1829, is situated within Nunavut in the Canadian Arctic. The northernmost reaches of the peninsula run parallel to the corridor that would later be recognised as the Northwest Passage. The Boothia panorama presents the winter quarters of the HMS Victory in 1830, accounting for the locations and local Inuit they came into contact with, as well as the magnetic North Pole, which James Ross was responsible for determining in 1831 as a member of his uncle's expedition. Unlike Robert Burford's summer and winter views and View of the Polar Regions, which was politically motivated given the support of the Admiralty, Boothia was intended to primarily communicate geographic and scientific discovery. If we look at the Boothia panorama projected onto the fold-out pages of the book, the effect is akin to that of looking into a kaleidoscope. Ice hummocks are shaded into geometric and refracted forms around the central circle and appear to break through the frozen sea, upon which men from Ross's expedition stand and a vessel is caught in the ice. The surrounding peaks and mountains merge out towards the edges, becoming more distorted and elongated as the cyclical horizon fades away. Ice itself takes on a kaleidoscopic character as its surface is fragmented, and as I discuss shortly, the complexities of its colour are revealed. The printed image of the Boothia panorama further recalls the fisheye lens, itself a method of distorting a panoramic image. With no defined horizon or endpoint, the ice appears as a never-ending and all-surrounding environment, undulating as the surface of the water forces the frozen mass of the ice upwards. Burford wrote that, quote, "the sea presents one continued field of ice," end quote. Unlike the mountains beyond, which are largely static and reaffirm the long timescales of geological history, ice enables a more dynamic picture. Here, the spectators were informed they were viewing the surrounding panorama from the perspective of the tent Captain John Ross slept in during his polar voyage. While physically located at the centre of the panorama, the spectator is left to envisage themselves in the Arctic, surrounded by circumambient ice, vessels encased in frozen matter, against a backdrop of far-rising, snow-encrusted mountains. This infinite impression might also be reframed to suggest the finite future of ice in the Anthropocene. In contrast to the continuous 360-degree panorama, the moving panorama more broadly facilitated public dissemination, reaching wider audiences beyond urban and emergent industrial centres. The provinciality of moving panorama locations, as John Plunkett recognises, offered, quote, "an experience of inhabiting a simultaneity of spaces," end quote. Mr. Marshall, in particular, adapted panoramas to a movable and regional exhibition model, exhibiting in larger cities, as well as smaller, more provincial locations, allowing several shows to take place simultaneously. Their moving panoramas were often described as peristrephic, which, unlike the 360-degree panorama, signalled a large convex and semicircular image composed as a sequence of tableaux. These could be presented one after the other in narrative succession. In 1820 to 21, Mrs. Marshall's grand peristrephic panorama of the polar regions travelled to locations including Glasgow, Nottingham, Leeds, Hull, and Bristol, as well as being shown at the Leicester Square Rotunda in London. Despite no surviving visual record of the grand peristrephic panorama, for a sense of what visitors saw, the visual key for Barker's earlier and inspiration the north coast of Spitsbergen and watercolours made by Lieutenant Frederick William Beechey give us some indication. The accompanying pamphlet for the Grand Peristrephic Panorama, itself based on the 1819 description upon which it was also based, notes that it depicts the north coast of Spitsbergen, Baffin's Bay, and the so-called Arctic Highlands. Barker's image was painted from drawings and watercolours by Frederick William Beechey, who also accompanied Captain Buchan on his 1818 expedition seeking the North Pole. This was part of a twin expedition, with Buchan's voyage centred on scientific discovery and observation, and that of Ross on imperial exploration and expansion. In the pamphlet, emotional pointers are interspersed with scientific and geographical information, including latitude and longitude. And the author, presumably Beechey, wrote that, quote, "the yellow tint over the horizon is intended to represent the ice blink, a phenomenon always seen over any compact aggregation of ice, whenever the horizon is tolerably free from clouds," end quote. In other words, a white glare at the horizon often reflected off the ice and onto the underside of low-hanging clouds. At this point, the author, again, presuming this is Beechey, directed the intended audience to William Scoresby's contemporaneous publication, Arctic Regions and the Northern Whale Fishery, and his thoughts on polar ice. And so this scientific discovery is fundamental to how panoramas especially, but more broadly frozen landscapes, might be understood beyond a preoccupation with heroism and exploration. Barker's key exaggerates the scale of the ice with vast protruding fragments in the foreground, reaffirming the never-ending ice, in contrast to Beechey's softly painted watercolours of Red Hill. Geographical descriptors of Red Hill are also noted in the margins. Here, the Dorothea and Trent are trapped in the ice, corresponding with elements of view 2 of the Grand Peristrephic Panorama. Both ships are attached by ropes, lassoed to the ice anchors or large mounds of ice, stabilizing the vessels in the sea ice where they were beset for 13 days. The clearing of ships' decks, the gathering of ice for water, and the washing line resplendent with the brightly coloured laundry of the officers all signal a domestic Arctic in contrast to the scientific and geographic focus of the expedition. Robert Peck writes that, quote, domesticity defies the unfathomable immensity and unsettling chaos of the polar regions. The same effect is arguably achieved in the Boothia, with the viewer centred in Sir John Ross's tent. The performance and circulation of ice within Arctic panoramas inspired both awe and terror. Beechey described how, quote, masses have been seen assuming the shape of a Gothic church, composed of crystal of the richest sapphirine blue, tables of 1 or more feet, and often immense flat-roofed temples like those of Luxor or the Nile, supported by round transparent columns of cerulean hue, float by the astonished spectator, end quote. There is a lot to unpack in this description. Beyond the religious iconography, both ancient and medieval, the emphasis on the cerulean and sapphirine blue encourages a discussion of the colour of ice that moves away from an assumed Arctic whiteness. So in my other work, I've argued that the representations of ice in Norway's Arctic, including its glaciers Engebring and Oksfjordjökull, introduce the idea of a prismatic Arctic as opposed to the white Arctic that prevails in our historical scholarship. Quote, the blues and greens that refract and reflect off the snow, ice and water indicate the eco-critical possibilities of colour. They offer an understanding of the Arctic as not merely a white snow-covered space, but embrace the effects of light in the polar climate. Seen alongside Lal Ducker and Geoffrey Cohen's elemental eco-criticism, a tonal eco-criticism looks further to the intrinsic characteristics of ice. Ice that, quote, resembled white sugar and was incapable of being slid on like the British ice, as Beechey described it, characterised this Arctic panoramic environment. The movement of the ice and landscape not staying put in any one location, but rather moving from one temporary state to another, is further evoked by the panorama as a visual medium which allowed for the movement of places beyond their physical borders. The conflation of different Arctic landscapes in one panorama is especially suited to the multiple scenes accommodated by such technology. Erkki Hotamo writes that, quote, the pantomimic imagination had no scruples about converting facts into patriotic fairy tales, and ties this to the nationalistic thinking and construction of the panoramic image by conflating different national landscapes. In the case of Mrs. Marshall's Grand Peirstrefic Panorama and Barker's earlier view of the polar regions, the inclusion of a territory beyond British imperial control, that of Svalbard, especially here, looks back to centuries of colonial history, primarily that of whaling in and around the Norwegian Arctic archipelago. So this brings me right up to the present day, well, more or less. Svalbard reappears in the work of photographer Tyrone Mattinson, to who I'm now going to just spend the last few minutes talking about. Since 2011, Mattinson, in collaboration with the glaciologist Per Holmlund and a team of geologists, have conducted photographic research into the history of Svalbard's glaciers as it pertains directly to visual records. Beginning with the photographs by the Norwegian Anders Bjerre Vilse of Svalbard's mountains and glaciers, Mattinson, through the Northwest Spitsbergen Glacier Record Project, has created a visual mapping of Svalbard's glacial and visual history, quote, telling its story and setting up a survey system for photography-based glacier monitoring, end quote. ICE is adapted to an archival role with environmental rephotography, creating a digital research archive from the complexity of the beauty of ice, as Mattinson notes it. Here, Mattinson's panoramic glacial photography records these landscapes as humans irrevocably change or destroy them. His documentary images are rooted in a historical understanding of Svalbard's glaciers, utilising archival and visual material to account for glacial change on a local and regional scale. Contrasting aesthetics in the collage layout of many of his compositions, Mattinson draws upon expeditionary and scientific imagery and accounts to trace glacial history and anticipate our glacial future. I bring his work into conversation here by proposing that by looking at the panoramic and wide lens photographs made by environmental photographer Mattinson, alongside his most recent work in recreating the panoramic experience through VR technology, it indicates an analogous interest in the visual history of glaciological expansion and retreat that provides a framework for the recreation of panoramic imagery at the intersection of art, science, and exploration. In Mattinson's photography, the panoramic medium molds itself to the temporality of ice and the story of Svalbard's glaciers over time. In juxtaposing past and present images of Svalbard's glaciers, Mattinson's works are often composite images of photographs, old and new. Panorama Fuglafjorden 1873 to 2016 is one such example. The historic image of Fuglafjorden's largest glacier, Svitjotbrin, is a digitized version of Axel Envall's glass plate negatives taken in 1872. Ice is captured and preserved in glass, fragile, mutable, and susceptible to changing climates, an analogous material. From 1872 to 73, Envall was the physician and photographer for Adolf Erik Nordenskiöld's overwintering expedition in northern Svalbard. In Envall's photography, the effects of cold climate really manifest themselves. In his series of snapshots of Svitjotbrin, the landscape has been dismantled and anatomized with 5 separate frames collated by Mattinson to create this panorama. In this instance, however, the implied continuity has been fragmented. When viewed in succession, Envall's photographs create an imperfect panoramic image or photographic mosaic. An attempt to form a panorama, it's worth also noting, had been made in 1873, but notably involved retouching the images to create a continuous picture. So historical, cultural, and scientific perspectives all converge not only in historic panoramas, but in the process of Mattinson's rephotography, drawing attention to art historical sources that have previously not been considered within this context. The focus is no longer on narratives of Arctic exploration, imperialism, or even the sublime, but rather on ice and its processes. With this, and as a means by which to unify the panorama, photograph, moving picture, I want to conclude by proposing that virtual reality technology exists, like ice, as an interstitial medium. It offers panoramic modes of seeing, whereby a continuous image is captured and contained over time as well as space. Ongoing work by Mattinson, the filmmaker Gorki Glaser-Muller, and glaciologist Erik Mannerfeldt looks to create a virtual glacial environment through 3D models, drone photogrammetry, 180-degree stereo films, and 360-degree stereo film, offering audiences the opportunity to interact with the landscape and archival sources at a distance. Much like the historic panorama, the expanded rephotography project will allow viewers to, quote, visit specific sites, navigate through immersive passages of time, and make their own observations of the effects of a climate in transition, end quote. This will be accompanied by sounds of carving glaciers, tumbling rocks, and the wind and sea, alongside drone footage, which provides an aerial perspective to the totalizing effect of VR. As Mattinson shared with me, this project is also part of the new visualization dome, WISDOME, being constructed at the Universium in Göteborg, scheduled to open in the summer of 2023, and I haven't been able to quite identify if it has or hasn't. I know the WISDOME just opened at Tekniska in Stockholm this past week, where environmental rephotography looks to recreate and evaluate ecological and geological change in the landscape. Experiencing Svalbard's glaciers through the expanded rephotography of VR offers a continuous panoramic image through time as well as space that communicates the same contemporary interest in documenting ice loss. So while sublime and fantastical, the circular and moving panorama, as well as contemporary panoramic modes of representation, present the opportunity to experience and interpret historic and exploratory and scientific engagements with glaciers and icebergs. Through the movement of ice into the panoramic format, the iceberg's journey becomes even greater than before. It is not that this, quote, wandering chunk of matter doomed human civilization to an inevitable collision course with the icescape, end quote, but rather that it gave humans the opportunity to experience the peregrinations of glaciers, icebergs, and sea ice in landscapes otherwise far removed and distant. Rather than solely anticipating ice loss, art history and visual culture can offer alternative icy imaginaries, histories, and environmental realities. Thank you.